So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Black History Month with Dr. Andrea A. Davis. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Manza Chinto Yankee, the Graduate Research Assistant for the Anti-Racism Lab, led by Dr. Shirley Ann Tate, the Canada Research Chair, Tier 1 for Feminism and Intersectionality. So before we begin to commemorate Black History Month, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement that the University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are situated on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. And so to start off Black History Month event, I'm going to invite our presiding elder, Elder Hilliard, to give us a blessing.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you are all well and had a pleasant Family Day holiday. I am humbled to be your presiding elder to offer blessings on the context of the meeting and to the scholars. As your presiding elder, I have had the pleasure to meet many different people from different societies of many countries. The value of these meetings foster an exchange of knowledge and conversation. Narratives of wisdom and insight from many different writers, storytellers, academics are exchanged on the impact of racism and discrimination that is based on the color of our skin. On a personal note, after being subjugated in the horrific residential school legacy, as an elder, I am motivated to create a positive impact on the future of Turtle Island. To choose a lifestyle of kindness, understanding, and a deep sense of community without the barriers of discrimination and racism. Creator, I give thanks today for the family, friends, and colleagues. I pray for tolerance and understanding among all those who journey on Mother Earth. Bless those who suffer from injustice and oppression from the dark impacts of colonialization. Bless us that our words cause peace and understanding instead of strife and mental anguish. Bless us to transcend the joy of inclusion instead of heartache of loneliness. Bless our words of wisdom and let them come from our mouth. Bless us to strengthen those around us with our support of knowledge and truths, to offer kindness to those who carry the emotional burden and hurt from racial discrimination. Creator, we ask that you transcend your divine light to those who are afflicted with sorrow, sickness, fear, emotional and mental anguish from the bitterness and outright exclusion of evil entities. Bless us with the sacred gift of integrity to do the right thing, to right the wrongs of unkind societies. Bless us with a deep appreciation of our Mother Earth. Bless us, Creator, for all we do today, tomorrow, and into our futures. We thank our Creator at every sunrise and at every sunset. Kinanaskom tinawa nuago maganak miopmatsuin ekse. Thank you. Hi.
Thank you, Elder Hilliard, for your blessing. As always, thank you so much for your prayers. So next, I'm going to welcome our speaker for Black History Month, Dr. Andrea A. Davis. Dr. Andrea A. Davis is a professor of Black Cultures of the Americas in the Department of Humanities at York University in Toronto. As chair of the Department of Humanities from 2015 to 2020, she developed the Black Canadian Studies Certificate, one of the only 2 Black Studies programs in Canadian universities at the time. As inaugural special advisor on anti-Black racism strategies in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies from 2020 to 2021, she organized webinars and teach-ins that each attracted hundreds of participants, adjudicated funding for anti-Black racism strategies, and helped to develop new programs to support students and emerging and early career researchers. Most recently, as academic convener of the 2023 Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences, a gathering of over 10,000 delegates, she led a transformative vision of humanities, social science, and arts-based research grounded in Indigenous and Black thought and extensive community collaboration. A leading scholar in Black studies in Canada, her widely published interdisciplinary research is rooted in an anti-racism feminist theoretical framework that analyzes questions of race and gender through a focus of on literary and cultural productions of Black women, the location of the Caribbean diaspora communities in Canada, and constructions of Black youth masculinities. Her recent book, Horizon, Sea, Sound, Caribbean and African Women's Cultural Critiques of Nation, she explores possibilities for collaboration among Indigenous, Black, and other racialized women and offers new reflections on the relationship between the Caribbean and Canada. She's been invited to present her research in Ghana, South Africa, United Kingdom, Austria, Germany, Australia, and across the Caribbean and the United States. As a public intellectual and sought-after speaker, she has also made numerous presentations to schools, government, business, and community organizations. An accomplished scholar and fierce advocate for students, she has won teaching awards at the faculty, university, and national levels, including a 2021 3M National Teaching Fellowship. She has also been recognized with many community awards, including an outstanding research profile in the Council of Ontario University's 2020, 2012, 2013 Research Matters campaign, a 2017 Renaissance Award from Afro Global Television, a 2018 selection as one of 100 accomplished Black Canadian women, and a nomination for a YWCA Toronto Women of Distinction Award. She's currently co-editing with Leslie Saunders the Handbook to Black Canadian Literature and is a co-editor of the Journal of Canadian Studies. So we are pleased to welcome again Dr. Andrea A. Davis from York University. Thank you so much for joining us today, Andrea, and for your upcoming talk.
Thank you so much, Manzo, for that incredibly generous introduction. My thanks also to Elder Hilliard for those blessings which I receive and we all receive with humility. To Professor Tate, it's always a pleasure to share space with you and to think with you. And I'm so proud of the work that you are doing here. Thank you for the invitation. Today I'm coming to you from my office at York University on lands that have been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat, and that are subject to the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant and agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And this covenant frames in part my own thinking today, what it means to live in relation, never to take more than you need, never to dirty the bowl, always to leave something for others, and to live in an understanding of our shared lives and what it means to live and walk in reciprocity. I'm going to try to share my slides, some slides with you. Let's see if I'm able to do that. All right, how do I change my view? Let's see. Okay, there we are. Are you able to see, Manzo? Okay, good.
Yeah, we're able to see. Yeah.
All right, wonderful. So today I'm thinking about what it means to think Blackness as relation. At the 2023 NBA All-Star Game in Salt Lake City, July Black, a Canadian R&B soul artist, was selected to sing the Canadian national anthem. In a sport event dominated by US athletes and where the US national anthem is normally the big opening production, July Black stole the night. In a simple but brilliant and bold act of subversion, she changed one word in the lyrics of the Canadian national anthem, setting off fierce debate and conversation on social media about the country's colonial past. By changing the anthem's original wording, our home and native land, but the reworded phrase, our home on native land, she registered the long history of Canada's exploitation of Indigenous peoples and the theft of Indigenous land. In recalling that history, she also situated those others, including Black peoples from Africa and the Caribbean, who through chattel slavery or more contemporary violence and dislocation have been forced to participate in the capitalist and imperialist functions of the nation state. By replacing the conjunction and with the preposition on, she disrupts the assumption of ownership made by the white, what Tiffany King calls the white conquistadors, interrupting their claim to the lands now known as Canada as our home and our native land. But in another brilliant and more subtle gesture, she also demarcates the different texture of belonging for Black and other racialized and minoritized peoples that makes this claim of ownership impossible. For many Black and other racialized Canadians, our histories, our memories, our cultures are deeply embedded in the constructed geographic space of Canada. But there's a different texture in the way we occupy this space. Even for those Black peoples in the Maritimes, on the prairies, or in southwestern Ontario, who have called Canada home for many generations, there's a precariousness to their claims of citizenship and history. Rather than a claim of ownership, there's an acknowledgement of the ways in which, through their various practices of survival, Black peoples have made life on these lands. And in July Black's important rendering of the national anthem, Black people stand and sing in solidarity with Indigenous peoples and other oppressed groups. The reworded phrase, our home on native land, is an expression of indebtedness, not to the nation state, but to its Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and to whom Black people have responsibilities as they share and live on these lands historically today and into the future. The questions that animate my book, Horizon Sea Sound, Caribbean and African Women's Cultural Critiques of Nation, are attempts precisely to sit with and think about what it means to be in relation with the Indigenous peoples of this land and other oppressed peoples of the world. How might I, for example, invoke again what Tiffany King calls a notion of mutual care that makes possible my own desire for a livable present alongside Indigenous futures and the futures of other marginalized others. In other words, how might I imagine a different, more livable future in relation to the other oppressed peoples of the world, wherever I am located, whether in the Caribbean or in Canada? I am seeking then to offer an intellectual and personal reflection of what it means for Black women to live and imagine a future in and beyond Canada in terms that are non-hierarchical and non-oppressive, and that might account for our very being as material, intellectual, collective resistance to the violent discourse of the hegemonic nation state. I first began to grapple with these ideas in 2017 during Canada's 150th celebrations of Confederation. The year-long celebration of Canada as a multicultural haven took on new meaning in an era when Canada and not the United States appeared poised for the first time to lead the project of global democracy. 27 was the year that Donald Trump first became president of the United States. By taking the North American lead on Syrian immigration and action against climate emergency, Canada seemingly positioned itself as the conscience of transnational capitalism in the void created by the then newly elected Trump administration. On July 29, 2017, 2 days before the formal commemoration of Canada 150, the Reputation Institute's 2017 Country Rep Track report ranked Canada as the most reputable country in the world. According to Fernando Prado, one of the Institute's managing partners, the striking thing about Canada is that the nation's reputation is equally strong both inside and outside its borders. Of the 55 countries surveyed, the study ranked the United States much lower at 38 and the United Kingdom at 18. The study also ranked Canada second for quality of life. Stories of Muslim and non-white immigrants, refugees, defying the harsh Canadian winter to flee the United States and seek entry into Manitoba and British Columbia, and of Haitian asylum seekers entering Quebec, were only some of the ways in which the study's findings were legitimized in Canadian and global popular imaginations. What went underreported in the media were the heightened political, economic, and social tensions in local Canadian communities created by the influx of thousands of mostly poor and racialized immigrants over a short period of time. In January 2017, 6 worshippers were killed in a mass shooting at the Islamic Cultural Center of Quebec City. Far-right rallies in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal throughout the year further dramatized the uneasy relationship between a sense of Canadian beneficence and expressions of intolerance. The narrative of Canadian beneficence was undermined even more forcefully by a refusal of the celebration of Canada's celebrations by Indigenous peoples who had little to celebrate. Confederation in 1867 had united the white founding nations, excluding Indigenous peoples from the formation of the nation state and ignoring the more than 10,000 years of Indigenous presence in the territory. The subsequent passing of the 1876 Indian Act functioned as an extension of the nation-state claims of confederation by seeking to manage Indigenous communities. As Beaulieu explains, taking away their political autonomy their treaty and land rights on the premise that their ways were, quote, savage, barbaric, and without value. Not surprisingly, Indigenous responses to the celebration of Canada 150 reflected Indigenous peoples' deeply painful relationship with the nation state, and resistance campaigns, including Resistance 150 and Unsettling Canada 150, centered a counter-narrative of Canada's colonialism, treaty rights violations, and land theft. This counter-narrative of Indigenous dispossession in 2017 paralleled the activism of Black Lives Matter Canada, which highlighted the precarity of Black life. These intersections, marking the precarious quality of Indigenous and Black lives and communities, were amplified again in the winter and spring of 2020 through a series of highly publicized police shootings in the United States and Canada. These events included the February 23rd murder of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, the March 13th shooting death of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, the May 25th encounter between Christian Cooper and a white woman later identified as Canadian in Central Park, and the death of George Floyd on the same day in Minneapolis, Minnesota. These stories, which people consumed in their homes during the COVID-19 pandemic, and in particular, the visual images and audible sounds of George Floyd's death, forced a sudden and dramatic reckoning with the historical and contemporary realities of anti-Black racism. Meanwhile, in Canada, during the same period, Black and Indigenous peoples were also dying at the hands of the police. DeAndre Campbell, a 26-year-old Black man experiencing a mental health crisis, was killed by the police in Ontario on April 6th. 3 Indigenous people were murdered in Winnipeg by the police within a span of 10 days. 16-year-old Aisha Hudson on April 8th, 36-year-old Jason Collins on April 9th, and 22-year-old Stuart Kevin Andrews, a father of 3, on April 18. A month later, a 29-year-old Afro-Indigenous woman, Regis Korkinski-Paquette, died after police were called to her home in Toronto. These and other acts of violence led to renewed protests in Canada against anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racisms, joining the chorus of protests around the world demanding the abolition of the police. Against this background of Canada's past and the shifting politicized context of our ongoing histories, I found myself searching for a theory of Black women's experiences that might help me confront and supersede the escalating threat to Black life and the narrative of the benign Canadian nation state. My concern in particular has to do with the growing mythology of Canadian innocence, the reconstruction of Canadian multicultural citizenship as a new stand-in for a model contemporary democracy that is assumed to be all-inclusive, non-racist, and pure, even as Black and Indigenous peoples continue to die. Repeated narratives of Canadian racial, gender, and religious multicultural equality have long worked to obscure the ways in which Canada denies the histories and rights of Indigenous peoples, ignores and even promotes anti-Black racism, and privileges assimilation into a normative white, British, and French settler colonial identity. The celebration of Canada's paternalistic and racist democracy as benign, welcoming, and triumphant can only in fact be legitimized by ignoring the violence of imperial conquest and by assuming that non-Western European racial and cultural differences always originate from elsewhere and are allowable only within certain carefully delineated boundaries of nation and state. And so, as I note in my book, following the tradition of Christina Schar, I set out to do the hard work of thinking and caring Blackness. I asked, for example, how we might reconsider the terms of the Canadian nation state and Black women's relationship to it. In other words, what might constitute new terms of non-hierarchical and non-oppressive affiliations of community between Black women and other marginalized peoples in Canada and the Americas. In this inquiry, I'm thinking with three tropes: the trope of the horizon, sea, and sound. I use the first trope, the trope of the horizon, to encapsulate Black people's conflicted desires and to help me think about the possibilities and limits of Black people's various attempts to make life in the settler colonial state that is now Canada. Freedom seekers like Harriet Tubman, Josiah Henson, and others held in their imagination the idea of the North Star, a promised land taking them across the horizon from the United States into southwestern Ontario to a place closer to freedom. The African Americans moving from California to Victoria in the 19th century, and the Oklahoma settlers who arrived in Alberta in the early 20th century were stargazers too, following a horizon of possibility in search of something they might call freedom. And those of us who came later as immigrants, first from the Caribbean and then increasingly from continental Africa in the middle of the 20th century and after, were bringing a set of desires too, in search of something immigrant parents call opportunity, a better life, if not for themselves, then for their children. The problem with the horizon in every case is that it's a mirage. As you approach, it recedes. Its promise is ultimately a lie. Anti-Blackness followed the formerly enslaved across the Canadian border and denied them their freedom. Immigrant parents in search of opportunity quickly concede they haven't found it and transfer their desires onto their children, who find their own dreams proscribed in a society that doesn't care for them or love them. The trope of the horizon as both an opening and a limit to African diasporic people's future possibilities not only represents Black people's relentless pursuit of the promise of their dreams, but also the need to set and reset the boundaries of their horizons. Because we can still see the horizon, it continues to function as a deceptive sign. Its deferred promise of inclusion and participation manages Black and racialized people's relationship to the state through the suggestion that one day the deferred promise may be realized if we somehow manage to seize the opportunities of education and capital. Multicultural capitalism maintains the subordination of the working and middle classes by this promise that if you work hard enough, if you get a good enough education, you can transform your future. Racialized people are therefore encouraged to participate in competitive forms of citizenship, fighting among ourselves for whatever gains we can achieve. The terms under which we negotiate citizenship and inclusion seek to co-opt us into participation in the very capitalist, heteropatriarchal, and settler colonial goals of a hegemonic nation that is invested in our continued subjugation. The growing number of educated and skilled African and Caribbean immigrants in Canada, for example, obscures the social and economic challenges faced by historical Black communities, rendering them as largely inconsequential in struggles for civil rights. How might we refuse these forms of competitive belonging? And as we seek to practice Black solidarity, what might constitute other forms of non-hierarchical and non-oppressive community between Black women and other marginalized peoples in Canada and the world? In a conversation between Robin Maynard and Leanne Simpson, the scholar activists repeatedly articulate the importance of personal and political alliance between Indigenous and Black women. Quote, "We are both committed to thinking through what it means to engage in community building across communities and toward building Black and Indigenous futures without relying on appeals to whiteness or to the state." It is precisely this exploration of the possibilities of living in reciprocity and in relation to others in ways that refuse the nation-state's competitive models of citizenship and belonging based on racial capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and white supremacy that frames my work. I consider the possibilities for new, non-hierarchical communities of affiliation by exploring the historical connections and shared hurt of diverse Black communities, the pain shared between Black men and Black women, as well as the possibilities for alliance between Indigenous and Black communities. In this exploration of inter-community and cross-community alliance, I build on Tina Camp's grammar of Black feminist futurity by calling for a shared future now. This concept of the future now intervenes in the always deferred future promise of diaspora living, which is also a nostalgic, emotional, and spiritual return to a lost and unrecoverable past. I'm seeking again to explore the possibilities of African diasporics women's dreaming in Canada and their daily struggles to transcend despair and loss. This call for a future now, more specifically, recognizes that Black women's demand for the future they can imagine, a future of Black freedom, Black life, and Black joy, is also a demand for the kind of present they want to live in. In their 500-year presence in the Americas, or in their more recent arrival, Black women seek simply a present and a future they can name on their own terms, in which their bodies, lives, art, and vision have meaning. Such a present or future is undermined by heteropatriarchal narratives that place the dreaming of men above that of women, and by narratives of multicultural citizenship and belonging that place the desires of some groups above those of others. In the context of Canada, where Indigenous and Black peoples have experienced and continue to experience the greatest injury, and where the forces of anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism are arrayed against Black and Indigenous lives, it is difficult, as Robin Maynard and Leanne Simpson argue, to imagine a livable future for Black peoples that does not account for Indigenous futures, even while recognizing that the hurt and injury on both sides have not been the same. A livable future for Black diasporic women, therefore, cannot be fully realized without attending to the intersecting violence of settler colonialism and anti-Black racism. In exploring the experience of African diasporic women within and across histories of conquest, Indigenous genocide and Black and Indigenous enslavement. I am interested ultimately in how Black women conceive of new affiliations of community based on what Leanne Simpson calls consensual attachment and nonlinear relationship. These ways of being might allow for other ways of relating across difference and in respect of Indigenous life and sovereignty. Black women who are the descendants of enslaved Africans, themselves conquered Indigenous peoples, and who have been geographically and culturally displaced by transatlantic slavery and its aftermaths, remain linked to Indigenous peoples on the land we now call Canada. Indigenous peoples who were also enslaved through shared relations of conquest. Even as West Africa remains a site of spiritual and psychological recovery, no matter how problematic this project of recovery might be. For new African immigrants, the pervasive history of chattel slavery in the Americas seals their unsuspecting connections to Black people from the Caribbean, the United States, South and Central America, and Canada. The histories and experiences of diverse Black communities are linked across multiple time periods and national localities, even as the precarity of Indigenous and Black people's lives in the Americas link our histories and belongings in a shared search for a future now. Ultimately, to live in the future now requires that Black people refuse the violence of white supremacy, settler colonialism, and the forgetful nation now. It is to live in the future now is not about arriving at some perfect final point, the final horizon of one's possibilities. Rather, it is the insistence that each configuration of the present remains livable and that life will continue. To live in the future now is therefore Black women's attempt to improvise in defiance of Black death, to improvise in defiance of the surveillance strategies of the state, and to live otherwise. By refusing to be contained and by resisting imposed hierarchies of the human, we may be able to model more equitable forms of non-hierarchical citizenship that might allow us to be in place on our own terms, to live free without denying anyone else's right to life. This search for a shared freedom where we understand our lives, our own humanity, as contingent on and dependent on the lives and freedom of others, where we must attend to the suffering in the world in all of its contradictions with uncompromising compassion, is more critical now than ever before. And so I refuse a model of freedom in which my freedom is contingent on anyone else's unfreedom. That is not a world in which I want to live. I refuse the overconsumption too of racial capitalism and its destruction of the water, land, and air. What point is freedom in such a world? The nation state we now call Canada, and those of us who live or have settled there have a responsibility to the Indigenous caretakers of the land and to the people of the world for whom we are supposedly offering a model of liberal democracy. Are we brave enough to imagine and begin to fashion a kind of world making, not predicated on structures of hierarchy and oppressive behaviors meant to safeguard the rights and privileges of the few, while hiding behind a refrain of multicultural diversity or pronouncements of decolonization, equity, diversity, and inclusion? What might a world in which all of us in Canada, the Congo, Sudan, the Middle East, Yemen, Haiti are free look like? Ultimately, this is where I'm trying to reach in my life and in my work. It may be reaching toward utopia, but as Canadian cultural studies theorist Rinaldo Walcott asked in the 2022 Alchemy Lecture at York University, what might it mean to live a life if we can't risk desiring and working towards utopia? Thank you so much. Amanda?
Yes. Thank you so much, Andrea, for your talk. Just gonna quickly, sorry, I'm just trying to change the settings here. Oh, hold on. All right, thank you again, Dr. Andrea A. Davis, for your wonderful talk on your book, Critiques of Nation. So now we will open the floor for Q&A. So for those of you who perhaps have a question for Andrea, please send the questions either to me or Shirley. And then I'll read out the questions to Andrea. Okay, so just waiting for questions. If anyone has a question, just send the questions directly to me or Shirley, and then we'll read it out to Andrea shortly. All right, so the first question comes from Shirley herself. She says, that was a beautiful talk. How can we achieve Black solidarity and non-hierarchical relationships in the context in which we now find ourselves?
Thank you, Shirley. You know, one of the things that gives me great encouragement as a place to think about, but also live out this work is the history of Black activism. Black activism has never happened in isolation. There's something about that struggle that brings other people along with it, right? So I think, for example, of the ways in which Black people's struggles for freedom from slavery in the 19th century provided an opening for first wave feminism, or the ways in the middle of the 20th century in which the civil rights movement again opened up space for second wave feminism, for the gay rights struggle, even for expressions of resistance against the Vietnam War, or the ways in which the establishment of Black studies programs in the 1960s in the United States also opened up a space for the creation of ethnic studies programs, South Asian studies programs, and so on in those institutions. So there's a way in which, there are so many examples, the Black Panther Party for self-defense was deeply rooted in this sense of relationality, reaching out to other oppressed peoples to form solidarity, a solidarity of ideas and struggle. So that this is not something that is new, I'm saying, to Black activism, to Black struggle, or even to Black intellectual thought. It's deeply embedded in those historical and contemporary understandings of life and desires for life. I think that if we, I think that has given us a model then, right, for which we can continue to build on and do this work. One of the things that terrifies, that terrified white society about Black Lives Matter was this reading of Black Lives Matter in a kind of, in the normative hierarchical structure of the society, the ways in which white supremacy had always existed, right? So that one group is dominant only because other groups are subordinate. So that when Black people started to say Black Lives Matter, for many white people, the assumption was that the hierarchy would simply be reversed, that then Black lives were the only ones that could matter, and that other people, other lives, including white lives, would therefore be now made subordinate. That's not how Black struggle understands itself, right? If you look at Black Lives Matter Canada, the ways in which it formed deep solidarity with Indigenous peoples, with trans people, with two-spirit people, crossing all kinds of boundaries and refusing those ways in which dominant narratives have sought to separate us. I think we have to lean into that model and refuse those kinds of structures that want to present one set of lives, one set of possibilities as exclusive above all others. The climate catastrophe has shown us that that's not going to work. It cannot work. We have to, and I'm not saying that I have answers. What I have is a desire and a heart that is willing to at least think about how I might do that in my daily relationships, with my students who are which is probably the largest, sphere of influence that I have, how to model that in my classrooms that are deeply diverse in an authentic and real and genuine way, and then how to scale that up. That's what I'm trying to do.
All right. So we have another question from the audience. They say, I want to thank you for your talk. I was struck when you said Black women have been in the Western Hemisphere for 500 years. What would you say has hampered Black women's progress in that time?
Well, I mean, that history, I'm tracing that history back, of course, to chattel slavery. Depends on, where you are in the hemisphere, it could be less, but I'm tracing it back to that history of chattel slavery. Indigenous Africans, mostly from West Africa, were torn away from their peoples, their cultures, their own lands, and forcibly relocated across the Atlantic, all over the Americas, South and Central America, Brazil, but also Colombia, Mexico, all across the Caribbean, the United States, of course, and Canada. And certainly for the duration of chattel slavery, our expression of humanity was denied. So there was no place to even write us into the narrative of any nation, or there was no claim to life, no claim to belonging that Black people had. It didn't mean that we had no humanity or had no agency, but certainly that has marked our being in this place. And I think I said or tried to say that even for those Africans, for example, who have come to the Americas later, after 1834 or 38, 34 in Canada, 38 in the Caribbean, 65 in the US, later in Brazil, they are still marked by this history of chattel slavery, because Africa was the originating point, right, from which enslaved Africans came. And it was that geographic difference, as well as our physical and cultural differences, that marked our estrangement, our dehumanization. And so there's a way in which that continues to mark, right, all Black peoples. But what we also must not lose sight of is Black peoples, and Black women in particular, who have been responsible for holding and bearing Black community. The ways in which Black women's flexibility have an agency, have allowed them to carve out spaces of life that have allowed them to practice a kind of survival, not just for themselves, but in service to community, that have allowed them to carve out spaces of joy. And I think that all of that embodied history, all of that is what Black women carry with them and bring to them into every room they walk into and every table they sit around. So I think of my, Black women, for example, as having a different relationship to, Du Bois's notion of double consciousness, for example, where we are seen in multiple directions all at once. We can see racism, we can see sexism, we can see classism, we can see all of those. Our eyes are looking in multiple directions. But that wisdom then gives us a perspective that is critical to the dismantling of colonial structures, of white supremacist structures, so that Black women bring that with them to every committee they sit on in university, to everything they write, to everything they think. And I'm not saying they're the only ones, but you asked the question in relationship to Black women. And, so what I'm saying is that not to think of it just in terms of what we have had to overcome, but what that overcoming has allowed us to do. And for me, going back to the idea of relation, I think that the more you have hurt, the more you have overcome, then the greater your capacity to care for others who are hurting, and to understand what that hurting feels like. I don't think that Canada, for example, as a nation state, can heal without Black people, without Indigenous people, without their vision, their perspective.
All right, thanks, Andrea, for your response. So the next question is from Jovi Kreger. He says, I would like to ask a question, Dr. Davis. Can the possibility of Trump's re-election in 2024 influence Canada's effort to position itself as a multicultural leader in the international geopolitical arena?
Okay, so I'm not a political scientist, Jovi, so I don't know that I can only answer this anecdotally, of course. It's quite a terrifying possibility. I hope I don't offend anyone on this, in this Zoom. But what I actually suggest is that in 2017, that the election of that administration actually made it possible for Canada to kind of assert itself as the new liberal democracy, as a kind of new leader in the Americas that could lead the rest of the world. So there's a possibility that Canada could fall back into that role as well. I think really that Western governments, and here I mean North America, Europe, are really on moving back and forth between, you know, a kind of conservative nationalist politics and, you know, and something that appears to be more progressive. But at the end of the day, nation state politics remain deeply embedded in, you know, a model of life and living that is capitalist in orientation, that is hierarchical in orientation. So I think that whatever those states look like, there's always going to be work for Indigenous and Black people and other racialized and marginalized peoples and women and their co-resistors to do. It might look different from time to time and stage to stage, but I think that there's always going to be work to do to dismantle deeply embedded systems, regardless of who is, I guess, in power, is what I'm saying. And, you know, forgive me, Jovi, like I said, I'm not a political scientist. I'm actually a literary scholar. So I'm not sure I answered that the way you were hoping, but those are my thoughts. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So the next question is from Christine Martineau. She asks, she says, thank you so much for your wisdom. How do you manage the tensions of working towards decolonization from within a colonial academic institution?
Thank you, Christine. That is harder than you have any idea. That is hard. Shirley can tell you. I mean, I think, you know, I actually got quite sick over the Christmas break, and I think I was holding so much tension, you know, from the preceding months that my body just couldn't hold it anymore. It's very, very hard. On the one hand, I understand that I have really important work to do here, right? So for some of my colleagues describe themselves as scholar activists. I describe myself as a teacher activist, which means that my primary activism takes place in the classroom. So there's a way in which it happens in the institution and not just in my writing or my thinking that one might separate, right, from the institution itself. So when I talk about care and Blackness, I'm talking about classrooms. I'm lucky enough to teach also at a very diverse university where a large percentage of my students are Black. And so I understand that work as care and Blackness in a very practical way of helping them see and model a different kind of future they might not have experienced before, but also caring for them across their various other courses and sometimes throughout their undergrad and then into their graduate degrees. And doing that work in opposition to my colleagues who are not, you know, in opposition to policies and practices that are implemented without great care or understanding of how they affect people in real life. But also, you know, and as universities become more and more neoliberal, kind of based on this model of exchange, you know, I had a student today who called me and said she's interested in the Black Studies program. And then her next question was, what kind of job can I get? And I don't know how to answer those questions. You know, I don't know how to answer those questions, because what I'm trying to do is more than that. But how do I say that to her when she needs to live and she needs to have a future she can imagine? So it's a kind of oppositional, it's a kind of contradiction almost. But for me, I guess it's knowing what I tried to say earlier, that every time I step into a room, I sit in a committee, whether it's a hiring committee, a tenure and promotion committee, or other kind of, you know, supervision committee, that whether I want to or not, I'm doing this work, this oppositional work, this countercultural work. It gets exhausting, more in some instances, more than others. And sometimes we need to separate from that. I need to separate from that. So I was telling Shirley at the beginning, when we just joined, that this weekend, I did nothing. I did no York related work for 3 days. And it felt so good. And this sounds surprising, but I can't remember the last time I had a Saturday and a Sunday when I did no academic work. This weekend, I decided I'm not doing any. And I needed that, right? So it's that reminder that we can't take on everything. I certainly can't take on everything. And sometimes I get things wrong. Sometimes I don't feel very brave, but I think it's fair to say that as well. That sometimes I'm terrified.
But you are brave because you're talking about subjects that people don't want to talk about.
Oh, thank you.
I just wanted to say that. Like, it takes courage, right? To talk about things that people don't want to hear or they're not ready to hear. And I think that comes from all communities, whether you're like, because you have to address all, you're not, you're just addressing the Black community, but you're addressing other communities as well, right?
Thank you.
So you have a good narrative. Keep it up.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm trying. For me, I am really, motivated by, I'm talking a lot, but I've been doing a lot of thinking over the last few weeks about precisely this, what I'm doing here, what, as in the academy, what my purpose is, as well as my vision. And just over the weekend, in that kind of withdrawing and thinking, I know that what I have done historically and what I continue to do is to work for justice and compassion, and to hold those two things simultaneously, right? Because sometimes justice demands anger, right? It moves us to difficult places, but to balance that with compassion that also centers people and gives them space to grow. So that's what I'm reaching toward, both in myself, where I know I still have a lot of work and learning to do. Thank you. Thank you all so much for holding space with me today.
And thank you again, Dr. Davis, for your wonderful talk on your book on critiques of the nation. We do have more questions, and we still got quite a bit of time. So I'll go through the next question. So next question also from the audience. Here it looks like they asked 2 questions. So the first one is, they'll say, thanks so much for a wonderful talk. I learned so much. Thank you. I want to ask about alliances. How can we, as Black people / Black women, build respectful relations and alliances with Indigenous people?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. A few years ago now, quite maybe even as far back as 10 years, but something that I've never forgotten. I teach a first-year course called Cultures of Resistance in the Americas. It's really the Black experience in the Americas. And one of my students said in one of our tutorial discussions that all of us, we needed to reach towards what she called the need to know, which is really the need to learn, right? So that, and it reminds me in some ways of Bell Hooks' definition of stereotype when she says that a stereotype can only exist when we don't take the steps necessary that would make real knowing possible, right? So it's reaching towards this real knowing. I think that, you know, for Black and racialized peoples, whether we're descendants of the formerly enslaved, whether we've been here 400 years or 60 or 50 or 10 years, we have a responsibility to know where we are, right? The history of the place where we are, the people who have caretaken that place for thousands of years. So there's a kind of, we have to resist a kind of presumption that we have a right, right? Because many immigrants are coming largely, not always, right? Some are coming for different reasons to escape violence, death, and so on. But people are coming, many of us, for this thing called a better life. And if we just come and step into, you know, these lands, these territories, and act as if nothing happened here or is of significance here before our arrival, then we are really perpetuating a different kind of settler narrative, right? That is not useful. And so we need to know what that history looks like. Who are the indigenous peoples who have made my coming here possible? And who are the Black people who have been here before me, right? So the people who were enslaved, not in Jamaica, not in Barbados, but right here. Where are they? Why don't I see them? What is obscuring them from sight? And how do I make sure that I don't further, right, mark that invisibility? So it's making a commitment to read, to learn, to think deeply. And there's so much stuff now. I love Leanne Simpson. I love her work, but there are lots of other Indigenous people writing and sharing. Elder Hilliard today, I thought her blessing was so beautiful. And so much of Indigenous thought to me is rooted in that reciprocity, is rooted in that relationality. And also to understand that there are Black people here who live at the intersection of Blackness and indigeneity, right? So who are experiencing both anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism at the same time. And sometimes that racism is coming from within even those two communities. So it's complicated and messy. It's not to say that the relationship is simple. It's messy, but that's fine. That's part of what it means to live together. And I haven't been doing this work for very, very long. I think really I started seriously to grapple with those things only in 2017. There are scholars, Black scholars who have been doing the work longer than I have. But I think we start there by seeking to know, by reading, by bringing this into our classrooms if we teach, into our scholarship, or into our thought life. Because all of us are thinkers, and in our relationships. So yeah.
Thank you. So another question is also from the audience. They said, Dr. Davis, I want to thank you for so many insights. I was particularly struck by the trope of the horizon and its place in Black life and homing desires. How does this relate to stolen land?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you so much. You know, in 2017, when I started doing this work, I was reminding Shirley that we were actually part of a collective of Caribbean women living in Britain and Jamaica and Canada who had been, you know, brought together through a research grant to do some work together. And at the time I was searching for a singular metaphor or trope that would allow me to work through where I started, which was this sense of Black people's deferred hopes, right? That we had left, in my case, the Caribbean, come to Canada with these dreams, these ideas that never quite materialized, certainly not in the way you imagine when you first arrive. They slip through your finger, you can't ever quite reach to them. And so the horizon provided that metaphor of possibility because you could see it. And of course, you know, Jamaica, the Caribbean is in the is in the sea, you know, fed by the Atlantic Ocean. So the horizon is part of our daily lives. So looking out and imagining all of these possibilities, traveling, arriving, struggling to achieve, but always, always, this thing is just out of reach. I wanted to capture that elusiveness of hope and possibility for immigrant peoples, Caribbean and African in Canada. And then I had to really then interrogate what it means to even have those desires in the first place. How does that desire for arrival and then inclusion entrap us, right, in these settler dreams, this, you know, this kind of what I call competitive citizenship that, right, because inclusion into what? That is the struggle into what? Into what is not meant to include me in the first place. You know, that kind of first generation desire for a piece of land, which is a home, you know, whatever that else that is framed by that is itself implicated in a larger project that we have to complicate, if not refuse altogether. So the horizon really forced me to think deeply about that, but also to think about what one rejects, right? What one left behind in reaching for this imaginary horizon. And so the next trope, which is a trope of the sea, in that chapter, I'm doing a kind of return, right? To think about now where one has left, and to realize too that there in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, but especially in places like Guyana, Suriname, which have larger populations of Indigenous people still present, that we still haven't worked out, right, that idea of relationality, right, where we're still struggling with that. You know, then in the trope of the sea, of sound, in the last chapter, I think alongside the work of second generation, you know, Caribbean and African people who have been born here, who don't have that same kind of relationship or desire even for that same kind of first generation desire, and whose lives here are more complicated and more implicated in the struggle on the ground, the struggle for climate, you know, for climate justice, the struggle for Indigenous justice. Again, I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter Canada, made up in some instances of students I taught in that same Cultures of Resistance class, who are thinking in ways that are very different than the very early immigrants of the 50s, 60s, and before were. Some of them were. So I guess my answer is we do have to think about, especially inclusion, in really critical terms, understand what it is we're being invited to participate in, and to be careful about desiring that too much.
Okay, so the next question is from Julia Vescovia. She says, Andrea, that was a fantastic presentation. I am an immigrant and I can definitely relate and empathize with every word you said. In my opinion, it is hard to make progress until we make it everyone's business. Is it sometimes hard to create allies and move forward as we are building awareness and educate ourselves and others? I guess her question is, are there any books you can recommend that impressed you and moved you in a significant way? Thank you.
Oh my goodness. I have to say, thank you so much. You're all so generous and kind. Thank you. I have to say the book that I think above all others, and there are many, but I think everybody should read Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider. It is, it's small enough to read quickly. There are new editions, so it is available. But Audre Lorde, of Caribbean descent, lived in the US for some time. She was a poet, she was an intellectual. She was queer, doing really critical, groundbreaking feminist work, working queer studies at a time when nobody else was really doing this work. She helps me to think about a number of things, right? One of the things she says, I talk about it all the time, is that we haven't been taught how to relate to each other across our differences as equals. And it's true. She says there are 3 ways, right, that we really have been taught to engage with difference. So the first way is to ignore it, because somehow, we somehow think that differences are wrong. We don't want people to be different. We want everybody to be the same, or we want to pretend they are the same. Even if they don't look the same, we just don't want to deal with it. We don't want to think that people move through the world differently. We just want them to be the same. Might be a kind of post-racial world. That might be one way of understanding it, or it might just be willful ignorance, just not wanting to do the hard work of understanding that my struggle, is important, but you're struggling too. So that's one way. Another way we are taught to relate to each other is if we are in the marginalized group, then we are often tempted to imitate the group in power, right? So we minimize our own sense of difference by reaching towards invisibility, really is what this is, right? So we want to model the dominant culture. And then the third way is those people who are dominant, who believe that you are inferior, they respond to your difference, right? By trying to wipe it out, to eradicate it. So if they're straight, they want to pass laws to make being queer a crime, for example, right? They want to eradicate and wipe out your difference. They don't want to deal with it. They don't want to make space for it. But we haven't been taught how to relate to each other across our differences as equals. That is so powerful to me, that if we could at least try to do that, that we could reach closer, right, to what it means to live together in relation. There's also something else she says that is very powerful. In her thinking through what she calls the mythical norm. The mythical norm is the way in which in North American society, this ideal citizen is constructed as male, white, wealthy, young, able-bodied, straight, Christian, etc. And the ways in which very few of us, if any, really, very, very few can occupy all of that at one time, and certainly not Black people and not Black women. But something she says in that same paragraph, which is even more powerful, is that each of us, right, because we don't really occupy that mythical norm, each of us can identify one way in which we are oppressed, right? So for white women, that might be gender. For a queer white man, that might be his sexual identity, and so on, right? So for a Black person, it might be race above gender, above everything else. So we identify this one way in which we are oppressed, and then we not only assume that that is the only form of oppression, but we assume that it is the most important form of oppression, which allows us then to not only ignore other forms of oppressions, but even to participate in oppressing other groups, right? Because all I can see is gender, all I can see is race, or all I can see is my sexual identity. And so I can't see anything else, or I don't try to see anything else, so that I can say awful things about other people and not pay attention to that and think it's okay because I am focused on this point of my oppression. So Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider, without a doubt, is one of the most important and critical texts to me of the 20th century. Another one is Dion Brand's A Map to the Door of No Return. And Shirley or somebody, you could write these in the chat for me. A Map to the Door of No Return, which is a beautiful diasporic text. Dion Brand is, of course, a poet, so even her prose sounds poetic, and she's thinking about what it means for Black people displaced in diaspora. We can't walk back through the door of no return. We can't retrace our steps. We can't squeeze our bodies back through that door, but we hold it and carry it with us. So she's thinking about many of the things I engage in my book in that section on the sea, about what it means to, to live an embodied memory that you can't name. At the very beginning of A Map to the Door of No Return, she talks about her grandfather and how she used to ask him, do you know the name of our people? And it was right on the tip of his tongue, and he tried and tried and tried to remember and could not remember. So she couldn't, we can't map that way back. But what does that mean? What does that mean for people of African descent, flung out across the world in Amsterdam, in Toronto, in London, in New York, in these marvelous and spectacular ways our ancestors could not have imagined when they arrived on those ships. But here we are, right, living in that history. There's also Christina Sharp's In the Wake, beautiful, beautiful text, her newer book, Ordinary Notes. And if you are into fiction, because fiction is my thing, although this is very Toronto focused, David Cherry-Andy's novel Brother is just such a beautiful rumination, especially of second generation Black life in the city. So I think that's that's enough to start. So yeah, Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde, Dion Brand, A Map to the Door of No Return, Christina Sharp, In the Wake, and Ordinary Notes. And I said David Chariandi's Brother. That's a novel. There are
He was
tons
just,
of things.
can I just weigh in for a quick minute?
Absolutely.
I just want to lift up the University of Alberta because they actually had him here last week. And so he was at EPL and he did a reading of his book, The Brothers. And then he
Yes.
also read the new book for his daughter,
Yes.
which I wanted to share with you. And then he was there for a week at the University of Alberta, and it was really cool to meet him. Very, very humble gentleman.
Yeah.
And
He is one of my favorite people in the whole world. And yes, I forgot he was there last week. Dr. Buckner, he was there as
yeah,
part of Dr. Buckner's research chair. So I'm so glad you got to meet him.
yeah. So
He's
hopefully we'll
awesome.
have you. I'm going to put in a plug.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You got Shirley Ann Tate here, so she's got it.
Shirley can do all things.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, those are great places to start. Ronaldo Walcott. What's his last book? Emancipation. Or even what's the title of his last book? Has Emancipation. The Long Emancipation. The Long Emancipation.
Yeah, the long emancipation moving toward Black freedom.
Yes, yes. And of course, read my book too.
All right, and then, all right, so the next question then, coming from the audience is asking, how can we ensure non-hierarchical relationships in our own community organizing work? Thank you for your talk as well.
Thank you. In our own community organizing work.
Yeah, so they're asking, how can we ensure non-hierarchical relationships in our own community organizing work?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Because those principles apply just as much, right? In kind of inter-community relations. You know, as a Black woman, for example, I can't pretend, right, to represent, to even begin to understand the lived experiences of certainly all Black women, not even all Jamaican Black women, because there are so many things intervening, right? Education, class, you know, life, even desires and hopes don't have to look the same. And especially as academics, right? We have to be careful that we're not imposing our intellectual will on community, right? So entering community work as if we know best, right? Or we already have the answers, right? Because people in Black communities many of them are grappling with things very different or very differently from what we are grappling with. And so you have to make space for those, you know, those multiple perspectives and enter those spaces with deep humility, the same kind of humility you need when you enter Indigenous spaces. You know, and there's also, of course, a question of what it means for Black women and Black men to work in solidarity, on questions of race, but also questions of gender and class. You know, Black community typically tends to be very good at race, you know, calling out race, calling out class, not as good on gender, which still kind of remains intact, right? This idea that, you know, in an ideal world, right, that Black men would be, you know, reinserted into something closer to a model of hegemonic masculinity, which makes no sense within the context of Black histories where Black women have worked beside Black men from the beginning in labor and in love. So for me, part of that work is, right, is also one refusing a kind of larger narrative about Black men and Black women not being able to work together, not being able to love and care for each other, even as in refusing those narratives, we also, again, reaching for Audre Lorde's idea of working together across our differences as equals. So it's, you know, when as Black scholars, we are invited to do research or we get funding to do research about Black communities, often it's to, right, to repeat a kind of narrative of Black victimhood. And so we have to, how do we do that without doing violence to those communities? Or how do we enter even community spaces of activism and not, you know, take up all the air in the room, but step back and allow community people who have been doing this work for a long time to lead. So I think it's about humility. It's always about self-reflection. It's always about a desire to learn rather than to lead or to have the answers. It's okay to say, you know, you don't know, or I just need to listen. And sometimes to say, I'm sorry too. So, yeah.
Okay. The next question comes from Dia DaCosta. She says, thank you for your talk and the hope it offers. I was wondering what you think are the challenges of what you refer to as Black women improvising Black community across and with other racialized peoples. Or so, I mean, challenges posed by racialized peoples and our varied and uneven histories on this planet and on these lands.
Yeah, Black women's improvising. Sorry, I missed a part of that.
Oh, sorry. She said, she said she's wondering what you think are the challenges of what you refer to as Black women improvising Black community across and with other racialized peoples. And she said she's referring to challenges posed by racialized peoples and our varied and uneven histories on this planet and on these lands. And she says that she's asking this question as a dominant caste Indian settler on these lands.
And thank you, Professor DaCosta. You know, again, this is part of what I try to grapple with in the chapter on Horizon, where I talk about the ways in which racialized peoples, marginalized peoples are co-opted into these kinds of competitive forms of citizenship, where, you know, in a settler capitalist state like Canada that is dependent on maintaining a large underclass so that a small elite can be incredibly wealthy and powerful and successful. Space has been carved out in particular for Indigenous peoples and Black peoples as the ones at the bottom of that hierarchy who can bear the weight of that, right? Who are responsible largely for producing capital so other people can be okay, so the hierarchy can remain intact. And because the people who are racialized, and all of us are marginalized, but in different ways, there actually are different forms of racisms, right? So we experience racism in different ways. But because the space that is carved out for a so-called middle class, upper middle class, the spaces allowed within that for racialized peoples is so small that we're given this sense that if I am going to make it into this group, then you can't come with me, right? So this idea of the first this and the first that is very troubling to me, right? So that we are, right, taught to in some ways fear each other, to perpetuate these ideas of difference, of racial difference, that this group of brown people, and then within that group of brown people, within this caste, this group is better than this group. And so you're reproducing those hierarchies are only helpful, certainly again, within a settler capitalist context like Canada, or really anywhere, in shoring up the power of those, right, who already have it. And, so when James Baldwin, for example, says, I'm not anybody's Negro, it's refusing this, there's a way, for example, in which as, an immigrant who has a PhD, who's a professor in one of Canada's largest universities. I came here on a Canadian Commonwealth scholarship. People could point to me and say, well, there goes, right, a Black success story. But what that also says is that if you're not a Black success story, it's because something is wrong with you. Because here I have this example of one of you who has made it, who somehow managed to do this work and to get in, to make it. So why can't you do it? No, to even, so we can't encourage, right, that kind of discourse. I know that there are people here who were here many generations before me who did not have those educational opportunities. I got my first degree at the University of the West Indies. And that is not to say that classism is not in Jamaica and colorism was not there too. And I came out of the working class, but I also lived in a country that was majority Black. So in that sense, I had what in Canada would be a segregated education. I was taught by mostly Black teachers and shared classrooms with mostly Black children. So that there wasn't this way in which from very early I was told this list of impossibilities, and the way that people who have called this place home, who are Black for 200 years, have been constructed into, right, have been forced into. So that I have to bear in mind that, right, that history and walk in humility in relationship to that history. So that for me, when I stand in front of a classroom of diverse students, I'm not modeling success, I'm modeling care, I'm modeling hope, but I'm also, what I try to do is to hold my own students to a high bar of excellence, but also give them every resource possible to help them succeed. So it's, again, it goes back somewhat to what Audre Lorde said about, focusing on, we're kind of counting oppression. That's not helpful. It's not useful. During COVID, we saw the ways in which, Asian, Chinese, in particular, immigrants were turned against after 9/11. And even now, today, the ways in which, people who are Muslim, are discriminated against in really physical, violently physical ways. So again, it's a matter of understanding, of knowing, and then a matter of refusal. And not everybody will refuse. That's fine. There are some Black people who are deeply invested in this thing as it is now. That can't change their minds. And I can't change, right, the brown people who don't want to be in solidarity with me. But there are some who do. And there are some white women too who have mentored me, and even white men. And so it's knowing where the spaces of solidarity are, where the community of solidarity exists, what your community looks like, and to lean into that. I hope I've answered that in a way that is helpful. It's recognizing, right? Recognizing the way the structure works for its own benefit, and then saying, no, thank you, I don't want to do that. And it's not easy, absolutely not easy. It's very, very easy, in fact, to fall back into old habits and into old stereotypes. But it's that self-reflection, constant self-reflection, I think, that's needed to help us get past it.
Okay, Dia says, thank you so much for your thinking on this. And then Christina earlier said, thank you so much for such a thoughtful and lived experience response. Courage is the word I will take away. So that was from Christine. So we just have a couple more questions left. So there was one participant, I believe she may have left already. She was asking if you were connected with Brian Stevenson. I think he's like a defense attorney who is known for his work on justice for Black Americans. Apparently he presented in Edmonton recently, or EPL.
Yeah, what's his name? Brian what?
Stevenson?
Okay, I'll look him up, but no, I'm not familiar.
Okay.
He's right.
All right, so the next question we have here from an audience member, they said, thank you so much for your generous engagement with us and your wonderful ideas and talk. I've just been struck by what you have just said, our thought life. I just wonder what would be important to you in our thought life as Black people living on Indigenous land if we think about freedom.
Yeah, I think, first of all, it's defining freedom. And, the concept I share, the future now, right? This idea that freedom, like the future now, I don't think is a definitive point at which one arrives and knows and stays, right? This is freedom, and freedom forevermore. I think freedom, the struggle for freedom is ongoing, and the terms or the desire for freedom, right? Those terms shift depending on the world we live in at any moment, right? So maybe 50 years ago when we were thinking about freedom, we weren't thinking about the climate catastrophe. Now that has to be part of our thought life. We have to think about what am I leaving? What kind of world am I leaving for others who are coming behind me when I know that we are in this crisis? And to me, if you start there, then you have to think about what it means to be seduced into overconsumption, right? Where it's about how much I have, how much I own. That's not helpful to the crisis we're in right now, right? So those are some of the things I think that we have to grapple with. So when I say freedom shifts, right? A few years ago, even maybe 10 years ago, that wasn't so center of mind as it is now. So some things we will achieve, but then, right? But then freedom will shift. a scholar that I love very much, Kegura Macharia. He's a Kenyan scholar, and he has this wonderful question he asked in his work, which is how will we model freedom today, right? How will you live freedom today? That's a very powerful thought, right? If we got up every day and thought today, how will I live freedom? It might be freedom to experience joy, because Black people are not allowed a lot of space for joy, for pleasure. So that might be how I live freedom today. But it could also be living freedom for somebody else, right? It might be as simple as, saying hi to the racialized person who, right, is cleaning the room I am in. Or it's an act of refusal, or it's an act of gift of myself, my time in some way. I think that's right, that we have to determine what that looks like, is what I'm saying. Because emancipation happened, we still didn't have freedom. Independence happened in the Caribbean, in Africa, we still didn't have freedom. Right, so that we have to stop waiting, is what I'm saying, for this final arrival, and to think about how we carve out spaces of freedom, moments of freedom in the everyday, not just for ourselves, but for other people too.
So that was the last question from the Q&A. Don't think we have any more questions coming in anytime soon. So if that's the case, then we will conclude today's event, and just like to take this moment to thank Dr. Andrea A. Davis once again for your wonderful talk on your book, Critiques of the Nation. Looking at Blackness as a Nation. Very wonderful presentation you gave today, and I think the audience is very pleased with your presentation, as well as your responses to the Q&A. I think we all learned so much today about the importance of celebrating Black History Month, as well as celebrating Black history every day. So thank you again for your wonderful talk, and for your sharing your knowledge and expertise on looking at Black Indigenous solidarity, and looking at the importance of looking at the literature that has been looked at for many years from Black scholars, including yourself. And so, and thank you again to the audience for your participation, for registering for the event. Your support for the Anti-Racism Lab event are very much appreciated by all of us. And I'd like to just give you a thank you again for attending today's talk. Up next, we will have more events coming up throughout the term. So next month, we'll continue our decolonization in context workshop series. We're going to be heading to Finland. So Finland will be coming up in March 13th. Which will be organized by Dr. Suvi, as well as Dr. Reina from University of Helsinki. So stay tuned for more details on decolonization in context Finland. And then we'll be having a few more from South Africa in April, as well as Brazil in May, and Sweden in June. In addition to that, you'll also be seeing more anti-racism lab webinar series. We have one with Encarnacion Gutierrez Rodriguez on April 3rd. And then we also have Dr. Tamara Katosa in May, who will be talking about Black masculinities, and as well as Indigenous History Month in June. So thank you once again for coming, and we will get in touch shortly with more anti-racism lab events. Thank you once again, everyone, for coming, and enjoy the rest of the reading week. Thank you again. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all
Thank you
so
so much.
much. Thank you.